Hello and welcome to the February meeting of the Massey College Book Club, where we're going to be talking about Sally Rooney's book, Normal People with Sandra Martin. So before we get started, I wish to acknowledge that the land on which Massey College operates, and at least myself today I'm joining from online, is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we acknowledge their stewardship and are grateful to have the opportunity to meet on this land and to work here. So today we're talking and discussing a piece of literature and the story that it holds. Storytelling has a really long tradition in Indigenous cultures around a way of passing on knowledge and passing on morals. As Thomas King wrote in Green Grass, Running Water, there are no truths, only stories. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today with Sandra Martin around what is the story that normal people hold and what is Sally Rooney trying to tell us. So let me introduce Sandra before we get started. So those who regularly gather in the upper library of Massey College after dinner on the first Monday of the month, we have a beautiful dinner in the hall, and then we come downstairs and we sit in the upper library and have the book club meeting. Those who've done that before definitely do not need to be introduced to Sandra. But for those who might be sort of just joining the book club for the first time, let me introduce Sandra. So she is one of the original book club, Quadrangle Society members of Massey College. She's also the founder of the book club, so it's an especially lucky night to be joining with us today. She's the award-winning Globe and Mail journalist and magazine writer, and the author of several books, including Working and Deadbeat: 50 Lives That Changed Canada, and the critically acclaimed national bestseller, A Good Death, Making the Most of Our Final Choices. She's also the editor of an anthology, The First Man in Life, Daughters Write About Their Fathers. Her current project looks at the perils and pleasures of aging, which is kind of an interesting counterpart to this story about millennials, so I'm kind of curious to have that conversation. So for those of you who are new to the book club, we always start with a presentation by our guest, and then we start with the Q&A. So feel free to post your questions in the chat as Sandra speaks, and then when we get into the Q&A, feel free to add your comments in chat as well. So Sandra, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm really glad to be speaking about normal people tonight. The novel seems so pre-pandemic that I can't resist asking you a question. Can you imagine Mary Ann and Connell wearing face masks or social distancing in those sexually intimate scenes in the novel or the television series? No, I can't either. So how about we set the pandemic aside for the next hour? I'm going to talk about Rooney and normal people for about 20 minutes, setting up the characters and the themes, and then Miriam's going to lead us in a discussion. So let's go. Rooney, an equal opportunity novelist, has written normal people in the third person, but from the alternate perspectives of Mary Ann Sheridan and Connell Waldron, giving each of them separate chapters covering a 4-year period from January 2011 to February 2015. That coincides with the build-up to the Me Too movement, and it is also their transition from late adolescence to young adulthood. Rooney's route is a tricky one, through social and class differences and sexual relationships. Let's begin with the title. What does Rooney mean by calling her novel Normal People? I think she's talking about the difference between appearance and reality. Mary Ann is the daughter of affluent professional parents, while Connell is a son of a working-class single mother. Which one is normal? Neither is the short answer. Class is not a guarantee of security, nor is poverty an indicator of inferiority. Mary Ann and Connell are equally intelligent, but doing well in school, like socioeconomic status, does not point to success or happiness. Otherwise, why would Connell be so hapless? And why would Mary Ann be such a loner? Indeed, I often think the title should be Damaged People, although I grant that is not nearly so enticing as Normal People. Both Mary Ann and Connell are struggling in their on-again, off-again relationship. They look confident, but he is anxious and insecure, and she is sexually submissive and emotionally vulnerable. And that, I think, is why Rooney calls her novel Normal People, to show us that there is no such thing as normal. We are all damaged. Normal is what other people appear to be, especially during adolescence. Do you remember that stage? I do. Not only for myself, but my children. And believe me, none of us wants to go through that again. At least I don't. Normal People is Sally Rooney's second novel, published less than a year after her 2017 debut, Conversations with Friends. She is what's known as a literary phenom. Born on February 20th, 1991, in Castlebar, County Mayo, in the west of Ireland, she is the middle of three children of a politically left middle-class couple. Like Connell, Rooney studied English literature at Trinity College, Dublin. An excellent student, she was elected a university scholar in 2011, and then, like Marianne, switched to political science. An accomplished debater, Rooney won the European University Debating Championship in 2013, and then turned her back on verbal arguments, disgusted by the way she could effortlessly assemble facts and ideas in what she called a state of flow to argue disparate sides of political and ethical positions, rather like debater Adam Gordon and Ben Lerner's novel about toxic masculinity, The Topeka School. Rooney the debater is clearly evident in her first novel, Conversations with Friends. Frances describes a bad sexual encounter with a guy she met on Tinder, condemning, among other things, his love of W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet. No one who likes Yeats is capable of human intimacy, she asserts with the debater's flourish. Rooney's disdain for her revered countryman, W.B. Yeats, is well documented. He was a huge fan of Mussolini, she once declared publicly. He wasn't just this harmless weirdo who wrote poetry. Rooney got into trouble for those comments in her homeland, where Yeats is a national hero. But she has learned there is a difference between expressing an opinion in your own voice and having a fictional character say it instead. I feel like you can really get away with putting a lot of your opinions, if you wanted to, in a novel, she told the New Yorker, a telling insight into the freedom fiction allows over the factual strictures of nonfiction. Like trailblazing female writers, such as Rachel Cusk and Sheila Heti, Rooney has dispensed with traditional novelistic forms of setting, plot, pacing, and character development in favor of cinematic techniques. Reading Normal People is as fast as watching a serial on Netflix and as immediate as exchanging confidences on social media. Published in 2018 in the UK, it was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize, voted Waterstone's Book of the Year, and Best Novel at the Costa Book Awards. The writing is like a graph in which one axis is emotion and the other is time. Social and class issues predominate. Marianne is upper middle class and Connell is working class. Marianne's abusive father is dead. Connell's is unknown. Marianne's mother, Denise, is a lawyer who is rarely home, while Connell's mother, Lorraine, who works as an underpaid and badly treated cleaner in Marianne's house, is a key maternal figure. You can see where her sensibilities lie. Like trailblazing, where am I? Sorry, I've lost my place, but I found it again. Here we are, sorry. As the book opens, Lorraine is cleaning the kitchen in Marianne's house. Clad in her school uniform, Marianne is sitting on the counter eating chocolate spread. Dare I suggest it is the dreaded Nutella. She's eating it out of a jar with a spoon. I mean, as a mother, I find that a disgusting habit. We could be snooping on a familial scene in which a teenage daughter is chatting to her stay-at-home mother about how well a boy she likes at school has done in the exams. Wrong. Marianne's mother is nowhere to be seen and won't make a physical appearance until nearly halfway through the book. Instead, Marianne is talking to Lorraine, the substitute mother, the hired cleaner, about her son, Connell, who has excelled at school. Connell shatters the moment when he rings the doorbell because he has come to pick up his mother after work and drive her home. Lorraine wants to finish the laundry first, which gives Marianne and Connell a chance to talk on her home territory rather than school, which is his domain. She admits she likes him. He allows he doesn't hate her. The setting is diametrically opposed to their power dynamic at school. There, he is popular, an athlete who excels at academics and sports, a guy who is liked by both students and teachers. Indeed, one of Connell's female teachers has an ill-disguised crush on him, which she will act out later in the book, much to his horror. He clearly has no sense of ingrained male power and privilege. At school, Marianne is isolated, friendless, and an object of ridicule. Perhaps that is because she wears a psychological armor, which she invented as a coping mechanism at home. It scares people off and makes her seem standoffish and superior to the other students. One of Connell's friends publicly ridicules her as flat-chested and ugly, but she is also formidable in her isolation. She is just as smart as Connell, but she doesn't cozy up to the other students, seemingly content to eat lunch on her own rather than fawn over the cool kids. She also doesn't respect hierarchies. When a teacher chastises her for gazing out of the window in class, she retorts, "Don't delude yourself. I have nothing to learn from you." Within days of their conversation at Marianne's house, Connell and Marianne are having sex. She is a virgin. He is not, in a secret relationship that lasts for 4 years as they move in and out of each other's lives. Marianne and Connell would be made for each other, eventually, if this were a Jane Austen novel or a rom-com. Instead, they are clandestine friends with peculiar benefits in what can only be described as sort of a love story. Intellectually, sexually, they are deeply entwined, but he refuses to acknowledge her at school, never mind admitting that they are a couple. He callously invites somebody else from their class to the graduation dance. As Rooney writes of the young lovers, his attraction to her felt terrifying, like an oncoming train, and he threw her under it. Deeply hurt and humiliated, she refuses to answer his texts or phone messages. Even Connell's mother is furious with him for the way he has betrayed Marianne. Like many first loves, it should be over. But both Marianne and Connell win spots at Trinity College Dublin, Rooney's alma mater. Their social status is inverted at college. Away from her abusive home life and immersed in a more cosmopolitan scene, Marianne finds acceptance among worldly students wearing waxed hunting jackets and plum-colored chinos. Connell, by contrast, has part-time jobs, one pair of shoes, and feels awkward in seminars dominated by smooth talkers who haven't bothered to do the readings. And yet, inevitably, he and Marianne reconnect, become lovers again, and break up after yet another, this time about his lack of money. At one point, Connell reflects on his connection with Marianne. At times, he has a sensation that he and Marianne are like figure skaters, improvising their discussions so adeptly and in such perfect synchronization that it surprises them both. She tosses herself gracefully into the air, and each time, without knowing how he's going to do it, he catches her. The risks that Marianne takes are more than acrobatic or intellectual. She grew up in a home in which her father beat both her and her mother. Her brother is a sadist who is defended by their now widowed mother, a woman who actively seems to dislike her daughter, perhaps seeing her as a rival. I had trouble believing in Denise, especially in contrast with Lorraine, Connell's loving and fair-minded mother. Denise is one-dimensional. Is there more to learn about her than the little we know? That she was an abused wife who is now a widow and that she works as a lawyer? Is her coldness a defensive mechanism or a misguided way of teaching her daughter resilience and protecting her less able son? Marianne's penchant for abusive men is scary. That is probably her idea of normal, given her upbringing. She even asked Connell if he would ever hit her, a request that makes him recoil in horror. And yet she continues to seek danger in weird sexual encounters with loser men who punish and shame her at her own request. Connell rescues her from sexual assaults at least 3 times, and it is not until late in the novel that Marianne has the strength to extricate herself from a sexually exploitative relationship. The book ends as it began, in a kitchen, but a very different one. In the penultimate chapter, Marianne and Connell are both back in Carrickley in their parental homes. Marianne's brother Alan has been threatening her. She tries to hide in her room. He comes after her, and the bedroom door slams into her face, breaking her nose. Doing something that would have been unthinkable 4 years earlier, Marianne calls Connell, lies about how she became injured, apologizes for bothering him, and when he says, "Can I come get you?" she says, "Yes, please." That's a huge admission for her. Connell arrives in his car, the same one presumably he drove to her house at the beginning of the book, assesses the situation, tells Marianne to get in the vehicle, and then confronts Alan. "If you ever touch Marianne again, I'll kill you," he says. "Okay? That's all. Say one bad thing to her ever again, I'll come back here myself and kill you. That's it. Do you understand me?" Connell says. "Say yes or no." Alan says yes. Connell turns around, walks out the front door, and closes it behind him. That chapter ends with Connell and Marianne driving away from her home of horror. She is trying to apologize. He reassures her. "No one is going to hurt you like that again," he says. She looks at him above the veil of white tissue, and in a rush, he feels his power over her again, the openness in her eyes. "Everything's going to be all right," he says. "Trust me, I love you. I am not going to let anything like that happen to you again." Months later, they go to a New Year's Eve party in Carrickley. In front of the old high school crowd, Connell kisses her. After they draw apart, he looks her in the eye and says, "I love you." Marianne reflects that it was so unlike him to behave that way in public that he must have been doing it on purpose to please her. And so she thinks, why not give in and become part of a mutually dependent relationship, one in which she knows he loves her? This is a different kind of submission from her earlier perverted notion of normal, in which safety meant submitting to domination. But it is still a submission, certainly in my view. Marianne's realization could be the ending in a traditional romantic novel, but that is not Rooney's style or purpose. I mentioned earlier that the architecture of the novel is like a graph. I want to reiterate that point and say that Normal People is a cleverly plotted novel, dare I say debate, in which nothing is random. As the final chapter opens, Marianne is making coffee in her Dublin kitchen and looking out the window over the campus as students in winter coats, arms folded, disappear into smudges. Marianne is neither admired nor reviled anymore, Rooney observes. People have forgotten about her. She's a normal person now. Shockingly, at least to this reader, Marianne has a part-time job working for a man who has no obvious employment and who pays her in cash. She thinks he may be a proper capitalist. I wondered as I read if Rooney was going to undermine her own socialist values and have Marianne succumb to the worst of social constructs for women. That idea is not pursued, let alone resolved, much to my disappointment. Instead, Marianne brings Connell a cup of coffee. He is horribly hungover and still in bed after a celebration the previous evening for the publication of a literary journal he edits. He was so drunk that Marianne had to take him home, an inversion of the way he rescued her in the previous chapter. Connell has long since given up amateur sport and taken up fiction writing, much like Francis in Conversations or Rooney in real life. Marianne has read one of his stories. It gave her such a peculiar sense of him as a person to sit there with the printed pages, folded over in the top left corner because he had no staples. In a way, she felt very close to him while reading, as if she was witnessing his most private thoughts. But she also felt him turned away from her, focused on some complex task of his own, one she could never be part of. Why? Because Marianne, unlike Rooney, does not have the imaginary life of a writer. This is something she lacks. As Rooney writes, an inner life that does not include the other person. While Connell is drinking the coffee, he opens an email using her computer, offering him a place in a graduate writing program in New York. This is a new threat to their relationship, one that awakens all their insecurities. But this time, instead of fleeing each other, they talk it through, like adults. Should he go? Should he turn it down? Should she go with him? Marianne realizes that the pain of loneliness, if he goes to New York, will be nothing to the pain that she used to feel of being unworthy. He brought her goodness like a gift, and now it belongs to her. Meanwhile, his life opens out before him in all directions at once. They have changed each other. She is now strong enough to persuade him to go, not with her, as she did when she wanted him to apply to Trinity, but without her, to take up the opportunity he has been offered. Will she be waiting if, when he returns? That is harder to know. But they are both mature enough now to take that risk. They are no longer children. That is what has changed in 4 years. They are adults. They have become normal people, or as close to that as possible. Thank you.
Amazing. So please join me. I hope at home everyone is clapping for Sandra. Thank you so much. So now we've got about half an hour to chat a little bit more about the book. So please feel free to bring your questions forward in the chat. I'm going to get the ball rolling. So one of the reviews for Normal People from The Guardian said that it was a really good book for people who wanted to get to know the avocado generation, which I guess was, pointed dig at how millennials are supposed to eat a lot of avocado toast. I'm curious about, in your reading of the book, what you took away as what Rooney was trying to tell us about the millennial generation and I never know if I'm part of it or not, maybe a little bit outside, the concerns of that generation right now in this moment, I guess pre-pandemic. But.
Well, she's writing about her own generation. She is just trying to figure things out. I mean, she is a debater, and I think that's pretty obvious in the novel. She sets up people who are going to be debaters, are going to debate certain points of view. And in fact, there's actually a character named Gareth, one of her horrible boyfriends, who is on the debate society at Trinity. And he has invited a neo-Nazi to come and speak. And that's because he believes in free speech, right? So she's presenting all these arguments that are about society and the kind of society she wants to live in. But she's also really trying to figure out, how do you make a real relationship with somebody? What are all the pitfalls? How do you do it? So is that particular to millennials? I don't think so. I think that's something we all go through. Now, she does talk a little bit about the Ireland and the economic problems, but really she's trying to make the novel universal, I think. And she is talking about the age-old problems of how do you form relationships and how do you maintain them?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, one of the questions that a book club committee member was asking about this was, there's on again, off again relationship that Marianne and Connell have in the book. That at one point I think they describe how they just keep coming back to each other and circling back to each other. Do you think the book leans more towards, soul, quote unquote, soulmates and that, possibility, or do you think it's starting to try to challenge some of those notions that we have one other person that we're fated to be with?
Well, I think that Marianne and Connell are soulmates in so many ways, but they don't know how to function in the world as a couple. He has a much better girlfriend in Helen, who's sort of an easy person to be and she has so much trouble finding a reasonable person to be with. But I think that's really, how do you function in the world? Kind of reminds me of Sheila, how can a person be? That's what she's trying to do, I think, is just between adolescence and adulthood. And of course, some of us never get out of the adolescent stage, right? I mean, we get older, but we never get out of that stage. Miriam, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily is about soulmates, but about the ways that you can come, that people who are in your lives and influence and change your lives stay in them in certain ways, and that you never kind of get leave those people who help shape who you are. I do wonder about her question about whether we ever grow out of that. Is that you're asking, like, is this an adolescence question, or is this something, are these insecurities that we have about relationships something that's just an adolescent coming of age story? And I was myself a little bit off put in the last chapter when Marianne is asking about Sadie and whether Connell is in love with this Sadie character who comes in, who has read his stories. And so it seems like you finished your presentation saying that, well, now they're having a bit more of a normal conversation where, they're both adults, they're discussing whether they should go to New York. However, just 2 minutes earlier, she's asking him, well, do you love someone else, even though they're now committed to each other? So it seems that she's suggesting that we maintain those insecurities even after we've, become more normal people.
Don't we?
Yeah.
I think that people are jealous of he has a work soulmate. Sadie loves his writing, right? Sadie is the one who's encouraged him to be a writer, to be on the literary magazine. And in fact, she's the one who's persuaded him to apply to the writing program in New York. And he hasn't bothered to tell Marianne that he is applying for that program. Like, duh. I mean, really, think it through. I mean, you should think it through, but Connell, he is hapless. They both need a lot of help in trying to figure things out.
Yeah, don't we all? Don't we all? Are there any questions yet?
And we continue
to. Are there any questions yet from our folks joining from home? Feel free to keep place your questions in the chat if you have them. I'll keep. Oh, we've got one. So Gilbert Reed asks, are there people who have no inner life, as you alluded to concerning Marianne? I believe, or M.A., sorry, I believe that's Marianne. But
yes, that was actually a quote from Sally Rooney's book. I hope that we all have an inner life, but what Marianne was thinking at that point was that she didn't have that preoccupying inner life of a writer, and that there are some parts, and they are really sexually compatible. We see and hear that a lot, but are they? And they're compatible more or less politically, but he has this separate area which she respects, and I think she resents a little bit, and that is his creative life, because when he's writing fiction, he's in another world, and that's what she's talking about. So to suggest, I don't think it's the character saying that he has an inner life, which she doesn't. And I think that's because the character of Marianne in this novel is very much someone who's always up front. She's always monopolizing conversations. She goes on and on and on about her political opinions on everything. There's quite a few scenes like that. But do we all have inner lives? I hope we do. I mean, do you, Gilbert, have an inner life?
I believe Gilbert is also a writer, I believe, too, so maybe has the inner life of the writer piece as well. Any other questions? Of course I do, but I am also a writer, but nonfiction, so I don't know if that counts in the same way. So Anne Shortell has asked, lovely presentation. Could this book have been written by an American or an English writer, or is it a sample of new Irish literature? Thanks, Anne.
Well, it is written by a young Irish writer. And I must say, when I was reading, I read Conversations with Friends, of course, and I read, obviously, Normal People. I kind of thought of Sally Rooney as a young Margaret Atwood in some respects, in the sense that she was just so clever and so able and such a beautiful writer, and yet so to the point, and really created an incredible buzz as a young, obviously Atwood is quite a bit older than Sally Rooney is now, but that same kind of phenomenon. I said she was a literary phenomenon, that she just burst on at the right moment, and what she was saying was relevant. As I said, it was in the buildup to the Me Too movement. And yet here she has a character who is not so much sexually exploited, but inviting sexual exploitation and domination. So Rooney is already twisting the argument a bit. I mean, that terrible line of, well, she was asking for it, wasn't she? And here we have a young woman who actually is asking for it, which is horrifying that she is feeling that way. So whether this is the new Irish lit, I don't think so. I think that she is a unique writer, and I think that she's speaking very much to the time. And she could be an American, she could be a Canadian, she could be she's really writing about a universal theme, which is trying to make yourself real. I think that's really, I don't know, but I can be wrong. I mean, obviously we're often wrong. What do you think?
Well, when you say it speaks to the time, one of the pieces that spoke to me, and I think is really relevant to, I would say, in all those places, is the way that social media comes into our lives a little bit. And I was really pleasantly surprised with this book about how she talks about Facebook, she talks about Skype, she talks about sending emails back and forth, which dominate millennial lives, right? We use these kinds of social media and online communications for everything. We're joining this call on online during the pandemic. But it didn't, she did it in a way that didn't feel too clumsy. And I think Conversations probably speaks more to that. But I was curious if you had any reflections on how to include this sense of using technology in a book. How do you write about texting? How do you write about sending emails in a way that doesn't feel clunky?
You send them as texts and emails. I was kind of surprised by how, not surprised, but I noticed how fast social media is changing, even in that book. I mean, are millennials on Facebook? I mean, rarely, right? I
No,
mean,
not
their
really. And we're not on Skype either. So in a way,
No.
it's almost
And
outdated
so
itself already.
that's right. So that sort of, I mean, that's like a clothing style in a way. It's just a device that you can use to communicate. In conversations with friends, it's much, much more tied to emails. I don't know if you've read that book, but there's long, long stretches of arguments that Frances and her friend, former lover and now friend, are sending to each other, arguments about this, that, and the other, describing things. So in this one, I noticed it seemed a bit quaint that they were using Facebook a lot, because I don't think millennials use Facebook so much anymore. I mean, do they? But social media is like driving a car or something else. It's just a tool. It's a technological tool that is helpful and dangerous, and changes the way you communicate with people. And in fact, one of the things that, people used to say years ago, because of the telephone, writing was going out of fashion. Well, then, of course, emails came up and everybody was writing again.
Are there any other questions from our folks joining from home?
Well, I'm wondering if anybody saw the film, the television series, and how they felt this was different or the same as the novel.
Yeah, I'm also curious to hear the takes on that. My own was, I was quite surprised, and it's on CBC in Canada, which is fun for us here. I thought it was quite a close adaptation. They didn't stray too far from the text or from the relationship, but I felt the two characters who played Marianne and Connell had a wonderful chemistry, even on camera. But I don't know what you thought, Sandra.
I thought it was very, very close to the novel, and Sally Rooney was part of the television series. I mean, she had a role in writing it and role in producing it. I can't remember exactly what her title was. I think she was definitely involved in it. There were a couple of things that I noticed. I thought Denise was much more sympathetic in the television series than she was in the novel. Much more developed. I found a little more empathy for her in the television series than I did for her in the novel. I mean, I thought that was a failing in the novel, that she was so cardboard, so one-dimensional. But the television series was very faithful to the novel. And of course, the novel is so cinematic. I mean, it's written in scenes, right? It's just, you could easily see that being translated, which is one of the things I think is so clever about Sally Rooney, and reminds me too of Atwood, how clever, like they know how to do this stuff, how to reach their audience.
And even, towards the end, when she says 5 minutes later. So some of the scenes are a few months, but the last scene that you focused on with her brother, at one point she says 5 minutes later, to break to a new scene. But I agree with you about Denise, because in the show, sometimes even when she didn't have a line, she'd be in the background, in the back of the scene on her laptop working, kind of looking sideways in a way that we didn't get to see in the book.
Yes, that's absolutely true. She was definitely much more present, and she was a much more empathetic character. And I'm also wondering something that bothered me all the way I was reading the novel. I mean, it's good in terms of setting up the characters. Why do we never know who Connell's father is? Why doesn't Connell want to know? Isn't that an odd thing?
Well, perhaps that speaks to his sort of the inner life question that we had earlier, because I think there are some places, some parts of his inner life that he very deliberately doesn't open those doors. And he says, my mother said that she would tell me if I wanted to know who my father is, but I never, that Connell never asked her. Yeah.
And I think he doesn't have life when he in Carrickley as he develops when he's at university. He has really opened up in lots of ways. And that's because of Sadie in one way, because he sends a story to her. So he's beginning to do it, but he's so embarrassed, so insecure about it that he insisted to be published under a pseudonym. But so the inner life is developing there, but I don't think it's very developed at all when he's an adolescent. I mean, he's popular, but he's good at sports. He doesn't really confide in people. He's horrified and terrified of anybody knowing about Marianne, which is really pathetic of him.
Yeah. Well, it shows what do you do when you're very popular but very shy, and when your friends don't actually know you very well, even if you have a lot of the friends. And so they don't know that he reads either. He's read the Communist Manifesto. They talk about that, him and Marianne, early on, and his friends don't know that he reads these kinds of books, and that changes. I'm curious when you talk about sorry?
I'm just saying he's afraid, I think, to expose that part of himself. And that's one of the connections with Marianne, is that she is somebody he can expose. And the same way that he exposes his body and his feelings and, his sexual desires with her as she with him in a safe place, even though she sort of asks him if he would ever hurt her. But I think that they are growing up, that's for sure. And he needs to get away from Carrickley, because in Carrickley he doesn't need to do anything, and he never needs to change. Right? It's always going to be the same. It's going to go on.
Well, and part of the difference there is being known by everyone in the town. I grew up in a very small town in Ontario where everyone knows each other and knows your parents and knows where you grew up and what farm you grew up on. And he moves to a place where the anonymity is partly where he can do that exploration, and which I think relates to a lot of people who move from rural areas to the big city of Toronto, even here in Canada. I wanted to ask you about that shame that, sorry, go ahead.
He wouldn't have moved if it weren't for Marianne. It never occurred to him to apply to Trinity College Dublin. He was going to go to Galway. It never occurred to him. So she has pushed him to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's going to go on a different program completely.
Yeah.
They speak, Marianne kind of mentions that at the end of the book, where she says, when they're talking about whether he's going to move to New York or not, she says that, well, neither of them would have been who they are today had they not met each other. He wouldn't love in the same way he does. He wouldn't, be writing in the way he does. He wouldn't have come to Trinity.
And who knows what would have happened to her in terms of personal relationships, right? I'm terrified to think. So yes, they have come together, they have changed each other, and they will exist separately. They're strong enough now to do that. I feel that's a very strong sense in the book, a strong theme.
I do think that this theme of independence comes up quite a bit. And one of the things that I don't know about anyone else who read the book, but who identifies as a strong feminist, in feminism right now, there's a strong emphasis on independence, on being independent and not doing all the emotional labor for a family, for example. Whereas Marianne, Rooney gives us this character who's not very independent and quite dependent, even towards the end, in some ways. And it was difficult to grapple with in reading as someone who kind of values my own independence, at least. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, she has a warped sense of independence at school, doesn't she? I mean, she
Mhm.
is aloof. She doesn't want to be with anybody. And so she says she doesn't need to. She's quite happy to sit at the school lunch table reading a book. Really? Who is? Nobody's happy doing that. So she has a warped sense of independence. And then there's that scene where she thinks, oh, yes, I could be part of this relationship. He said in public that he loves me. He's kissed me in front of all his high school friends. I could take on that role. Um, and but that would be a submissive role as well, in my view. And she doesn't take that on very easily. I mean, and she decides against it. Maybe at the ending is a bit too quick, in the sense that she has this realization that they are stronger than they were. That the pain of the loneliness isn't going to be the same as the pain of her feeling unworthy as she had before, that has given her this gift of making her feel worthy. So I think her independence will be different. Now, what is she going on to do? Clearly, the feminist idea of independence, it's okay to have that idea, and I aspire to have it myself, but it gets complicated by your relationships, right? And your family members. And if you want to talk about aging, my children are grown up now, but I know my turn is going to come, and who's going to take care of me? In the end, I'm not going into a long-term care home, I can tell you that, but it's going to be my children probably, right? And I know what's going to happen because I remember doing it to my own parents. You treat them like toddlers. You say, no, Mom, I don't think you should do that. No, Dad, no, no, no. And that's what's going to happen to me. And that's how these relationships, these independence, everything reverses and changes over the decades. There's a famous comment about we want independence for ourselves and safety for those we love. Have you ever heard that comment? And that
I
means,
hadn't.
well, it is actually
But
a comment about what happens to people. So enjoy the independence while you can, because it's going to
for the
entangle.
next few years, the only dependent I have is a dog for right now, so I'll be okay with. I'll take advantage of that while I can. Are there any other questions from the chat before we? I have another question. Yeah, we've got one. So Gilbert Reed has shared brilliant presentation discussion. Thank you and congratulations. I learned a great deal. I'm not sure that I have an inner life. So that was looping back on our earlier conversation about whether we have inner lives. Wonderful. Well, I hope each of us, as Sandra earlier said, I hope each of us does have an inner life. Sandra, earlier you mentioned that the book ends with Marianne saying that she now feels worthy, and that's something that Connell has brought to her. Throughout my reading of the book, one of the themes that I saw that contrasted with that sense of worthiness was shame. And Rooney speaks about shame quite a bit through both Marianne and Connell. At one point, if I can just, on page 219, Connell's reflecting back on his relationship with Rob in the book, his friend from high school, and about the incident at the I don't know I can't remember the word they have for the dance at the end of their high school, and where Rob shared pictures of his girlfriend at the time, and Connell's remembering back to this moment, and he says that he didn't judge him, that he doesn't now judge Rob, and he says he just wanted to be normal, to conceal the parts of himself that he found shameful and confusing. So anyone following along on the book, that's on 219. But I find that Connell seems to be hiding his shame constantly throughout the book, and that's part you describe him as hapless, but I think a lot of that haplessness seems to be come from this place of shame, and for Marianne as well. Did you have any thoughts on that? Did you see shame and worthiness as kind of contrasting themes throughout the book?
They're contrasting, and they're also very prevalent in the book. And let me go back for a second to Connell's lack of a father, and so he has no father figure, no male model, and his mother is extraordinary. I'd like to know her. I think she's a terrific woman. But he doesn't have any male figures in his life. There's no uncle. There's nobody who's there. And of course, Marianne doesn't either, because her father died when she was 13, and before he died, who knows why he died. whether it was, who knows that we don't know much about him, but he certainly was
Yeah.
brutal. So she doesn't have a real father figure, but Connell certainly doesn't, and seems to have no desire to find out who it is. So he has, I would think there's some shame involved in that. Um, like, who could this man be? I mean, if you're reading the novel and you've got this kind of mind that kind of works, you wonder, do you think that Lorraine was having an affair with Denise's husband, and that's how Connell came to be? Like, you can play a game with this, right? I mean, it's not literary criticism, but it is kind of fun. So, but the
I think
shame,
too highly of Lorraine for that. I think too highly of Lorraine for that.
well, who
Like
knows? She
you,
was
one of my favorite parts of the book is when he tells Lorraine that he's invited. He tells his mother, he calls her Lorraine as well, which he tells her that he's invited the other Rachel, I guess, to this Debs. That's what they call their end of the year dance, the
yeah.
Debs. And she gets so angry with him that she makes him pull over and gets out of the car and takes the bus home and tells him that, and that's the moment where he really feels that shame of his decision from his mom. I also agree that she was one of my favorite characters in the book.
But do you think, I mean, think about this for a second. Was she remembering what it was like to be having her relationship with whoever is the father of Connell, and she was rejected?
And
Was she
in a
living in
small
that?
town, what's part of the part with his dad that's interesting is that they're living in a small town. So it's presumably all the everyone in the adults generation in the book knows who Connell's father is, likely,
I
right?
don't think they do.
Unless it was also a secret relationship like Marianne and Connell's.
Well, that's what I'm thinking, that it was a secret relationship, and who knows whether it was in fact. I mean, wouldn't that be an incredible thing? Then Denise hires Lorraine to clean her kitchen. I mean, one can play that kind of game, which is one of the fun things about novels, right? You can speculate. But shame is a huge theme in this book. And we all have shame. And it's crazy the things we are often ashamed of. The things that I am ashamed of are probably things that you would think are ridiculous, and vice versa. But learning to come to terms with yourself and to make moral decisions for yourself and not succumb to being shamed. As Mary Ann, that's her comfort zone, right? Being shamed, being beaten
Mhm.
up, being abused, being exploited. It's
Well, and
sad.
one of the themes they bring in is the importance of forgiveness and apology in those moments. So one of the high school boys, I believe it's Eric, asks Marianne for forgiveness for having bullied her in high school. And I think there's another moment where someone asks, yeah, for forgiveness for having felt, and O'Connell, of course, Connell asking Marianne for forgiveness for having hidden their relationship in high school. And so perhaps there's something too in that growth that happens when you realize that the things you're ashamed of are actually a reflection of yourself, and you have to, in your relationships, ask for that forgiveness from the other people. Those are also moving moments for me in the book.
Yes, and one of the things about Erica asking for forgiveness, of course, is that she is now Connell's girlfriend, right? It's out there in the open. So she's not this
Right.
figure who this woman who feels, or this girl who feels she's too good for all of them. So they criticize her, they ridicule her, and so on. But now she's no longer that. They know her better, and she's Connell's girlfriend. But there's also the character of Rob, who there's a lot more to be explained there. For those who haven't read the book, Rob commits, he is a suicide at some point, and which is a shock to all of them, because he's a young man like them, and he's dead, and his family is terrified and horrified. And we don't know really what's happened in his family, but I think we've seen signs of it. The idea that he would show, as you mentioned, show around pictures of his girlfriend at a dance, naked pictures, is it's disgusting. And it is one of the things that happens with social media. It makes it so easy. I mean, people send pictures of themselves. And in fact, Marianne offers to send pictures to Connell, right? This is like,
Mm-hmm.
it's a strange thing that they need these totems. They need these symbols. And
But Marianne and Connell
It's
also have a conversation around consent with that, and around the process of agreeing when to delete the photos and how that process happens.
yes.
So they also at times kind of try to illustrate what it looks like to have consent in those intimate relationships, and in the things like even sending pictures to each other.
But consent is consent. But, once it's out of your hands, what if they have a big split up? What if Connell suddenly becomes vindictive and then shares those pictures on the internet? One of the things that's interesting too in that particular idea is that when Marianne is in Sweden, she
Right.
has a relationship with a photographer. He is an artistic photographer. And so they have a sexual relationship, and he is going to take pictures of her. And these pictures are very exploitative, bondage, so on and so forth. And at some point, she has the strength. It's near the end of the book. And she actually says, no, I don't want this, and walks out. Now, the fear is that he is going to use those pictures on the internet, that she is going to be publicly shamed by those photographs. And yet he never does it. He never circulates the photographs. Remember, that's a small point that in passing, she just, but
Yeah.
because there is
She goes back
that,
and gets them to delete the pictures later. Yeah.
Yeah. And
in the part around Sweden that there's quite a shift that happens for Marianne while she's in Sweden. So after her breakup with Lucas, the photographer, which is after another breakup with Jamie, the student from Trinity, who also they have a really bad relationship. She
and he's short.
ends up losing most of her friends, right? She loses most of her friends who take the side of Jamie, and then who start spreading rumors about her and about those pictures that you mentioned might be on the internet somewhere that they kind of say. And Connell says that he's never, he doesn't think they're actually there, that it's almost more of a rumor that it exists.
Yes.
But Marianne has a conversation with her friend Joanna, who's the one friend who kind of stuck with her throughout all this, who's the person earlier who people thought was kind of out of the friend group a little bit, but she's the one who stuck with Marianne. And at one point, Marianne's asking her about these rumors that are circulating about her in Trinity, and says, what's happening? And Joanna says, well, I actually don't really think that Jamie and Peggy are good people. And I thought that was kind of an interesting moment too, because at so many points, Rooney drops the word normal people throughout the book. There's several moments where she says normal people. I wanted to be a normal person. That's one of the few moments that she uses the term good person instead. And I was curious if you had any thoughts on this differentiation between what it means to be a good person and what it means to be a normal person. Does she make those the same things, or are there different things in the book?
I think those are different things. I think that what's happened with Jamie and Peggy is they're very insecure people. I mean, Peggy never shuts up. She's always talking, and she hangs around with Marianne and Connell. She offers herself up as the third in a sexual act, remember? And Jamie is the person that Connell has beaten at what do you call it? That pool very early on in the book. So they are not good students necessarily. They're a mess. And so when Jamie and Marianne break up, Connell is there, and Connell has, there's a fight, and Connell has taken her to his room. They sleep together that night, but separately. And so Jamie is the abused person. His girlfriend, that's one story, right, that could go around, which he probably did tell, was that that Connell arrived and Marianne treated Jamie badly. So they're not interested in the truth. They're just interested in what's being said, what's fashionable. They aren't good people. They aren't people I would want to spend much time with. But Joanna is the one who is always sending emails, right, and texts to Marianne, and they're discussing real subjects. And it is Joanna who is the one who says, what's going on with that employer of yours, the one who doesn't seem to have a job and is paying you in cash? So yeah, I would say that Joanna is a good friend, and she's a good person, and she's the kind of friend that you want to stick with. We all have acquaintances, even some of them we think are really close friends, but we don't share their values necessarily. and we don't really
Mhm.
like them that much, and we may move on from them and leave them behind if we're smart.
So perhaps that's one of our takeaways from the book. Leave behind the normal people and look for the good people instead. Sandra, do you have any last thoughts that we've missed about the book or that you want to share before we close out our time together?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily a thought about the book, but I do want to tell you that Sally Rooney has another book coming out in the fall.
Mm.
And, she has a Canadian editor as well. I mean, she started in Ireland, and this book is going to be published in September, I think it is. But there will be a Canadian edition of it as well. So
Oh,
that's something to look
fabulous. Do
forward
you
to.
have any hints about the topic or anything?
I think it's called What a Beautiful World. And I don't know what that means, since it's probably been written or at least edited and published in the time of COVID. So what does it mean? Oh, what a
Wow.
beautiful world.
Interesting. Well,
Mm.
we'll have to meet again this time next year to chat about her next book. Well, I hope that everyone at home has enjoyed our conversation together. I want to take this time to just say thank you so much, Sandra, for taking the time this evening to share with us. And it was such a pleasure to have one of, the founding members of the Quadrangle Society of Massey College, but the founder of the Massey Book Club back to present Sally Rooney's Normal People. So I hope everyone at home can just give a quick hand to Sandra. Thank you so much. I'll also share,
Thank
so our
you very
next,
much, Miriam.
pardon me?
Thank you very much, Miriam. I said thank you. It was
Oh,
really good talking with you. Very interesting. Thank you.
yeah, it was a lovely conversation. The next book club meeting is March 1st, so a month from today, and we'll be talking about An American Marriage by T.R.E. Jones. And I'd like to just thank quickly my fellow book club committee members, Alex Sarah Davies and Harry Malcolmson, who help organize these events, and to the Massey tech team. So behind this, well-functioning screens that we're all facing today are Matt and Alyssa. So thank you guys very much, and Emily, who helped to coordinate things. So really appreciate that. And looking forward to see you a month from today to talk about An American Marriage. Good night.